Jason Merrick never considered himself a man who sought out conflict. In fact, he had spent most of his adult life carefully avoiding unnecessary entanglements. A second-generation farmer who inherited a modest but well-kept tract of land from his father, he lived by a clear code. Work quietly, mind your business, protect your boundaries. His farm sat on the outer edge of a rural county where most people still waved from their trucks, left pie at your door if they heard you were sick, and respected a man's land as an extension of his will. It wasn't grand or modern. His house was a sturdy single-story with chipped paint on the porch railing and a weathered wind chime that never quite stopped squealing in the wind. But it was enough. His barn was clean, his irrigation system efficient, and his soil, according to the agricultural tech who'd last visited, was some of the healthiest loam east of the mountains. Jason didn't care about accolades, though. He cared about the rows of medicinal herbs he'd planted with painstaking precision, the lavender beds he rotated every third season, and the singular bull he had raised not for meat, but as a living boundary, a warning with a pulse. The bull, named Karma, had been born on the coldest morning of the coldest winter he could remember. Jason had found the calf near frozen behind the barn, and after a night spent wrapped in blankets in the mudroom, fed warm molasses and bottle milk, Karma survived. The irony of his name wasn't lost on Jason. The bull had grown enormous, oddly calm for his breed but fiercely territorial. He responded only to Jason's voice and never tolerated strangers near the barn. Most days, Karma remained enclosed in the far field behind reinforced fencing, grazing contentedly beneath the sun, a solitary figure beneath the open sky. But Jason always knew, quietly and without bravado, that if anyone ever pushed things too far, if someone ignored the posted signs, cut the gate lock, or decided that rules didn't apply to them, Karma would be the line they'd regret crossing. Until recently, that line had never been tested. But trouble, like weeds, finds its way through even the best-kept fences. The trouble arrived in the form of Karen Locke. Jason had known the Locke family growing up. Karen's parents had once owned the plot that bordered the western edge of his land, a sloping patch that dipped into creek-fed forest. The Lockes were seasonal folk, the kind who spent 3 months out of the year pretending they were getting back to nature, only to vanish when the bugs came out or the novelty wore off. Karen had been a loud, curious kid who used to chase chickens with a stick and once wandered into Jason's mother's greenhouse, trampling an entire bed of seedlings before claiming she was just exploring. Jason hadn't seen her in almost 20 years, not since she left for college and, by all accounts, never looked back. So it came as a surprise when, one spring afternoon, a white Subaru with California plates pulled into the driveway of the now-abandoned Locke property and outstepped Karen herself, holding a chai latte and talking into her phone like she was still on the West Coast. At first, Jason didn't think much of it. People came and went around here. Maybe she was just visiting. Maybe she was helping sell the old place. But within a week, it became clear she wasn't going anywhere. Contractors arrived, followed by landscapers and a delivery truck that brought a full patio set and several potted bamboo plants. Karen had returned for good, and she wasted no time remaking the old family home into something unrecognizable. She painted the siding a deep navy blue, replaced the roof tiles with slate, and installed solar panels on every surface the sun touched. She hung wine chimes made of glass and stone and placed a wooden meditation bench at the edge of the tree line, directly facing Jason's field. The first incident seemed harmless enough, at least at the time. Jason was checking the irrigation lines when he noticed movement out near the edge of his eastern plot. It was Karen, wearing oversized sunglasses and athletic leggings, walking briskly between 2 rows of freshly sprouted valerian root. She was carrying a stainless steel water bottle and humming to herself, as if the field were part of her morning routine. Jason called out, not unkindly, to let her know she was on private land. She laughed in that familiar, dismissive tone he remembered from childhood and said, "Oh, come on, Jason. I'm just walking through. It's not like I'm hurting anything." He said nothing, just watched as she turned and disappeared back into the woods behind her house. It should have ended there, but it didn't. 2 days later, she was back. Then again the next morning. Sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. Once with a yoga mat slung over her back. Jason, ever the patient man, tried the polite approach first. He waited by the fence one morning and greeted her as she emerged from the brush, explaining in plain, calm words that the fields weren't for recreational use, and that even light-foot traffic could disturb the soil integrity. Karen blinked at him as if he were speaking another language. "Jason," she said, placing a hand on his arm, "I know you're, super connected to the earth and all that, but you really need to chill." "I'm just grounding. It's a thing." Jason reinforced the fencing the next day. Karen found the new fence restrictive and claimed it blocked her natural energy flow. She left a printed note wedged under one of the fence posts, asking him to reconsider his relationship with boundaries and trauma. Jason didn't respond. He simply moved the note to his compost pile. But ignoring Karen was evidently the wrong move. Over the following week, Jason began noticing small disturbances. Broken stalks near the edge of his echinacea beds, cigarette butts near the chamomile rose, and, most concerningly, Karma behaving unusually agitated. The bull paced the rear paddock in slow, tense circles, snorting and refusing his usual feed. Jason checked the perimeter and found no breaches, but near the far corner of the property, just beneath the elder trees that separated his land from Karen's, he spotted a single glass jar. It was empty, but the lid was stained with what looked like molasses. Nearby, the soil was churned, as though something had been rooting around. Jason didn't make accusations. He made preparations. He installed trail cameras, not flashy or obvious, but enough to cover the weak spots in his fencing. He called his lawyer, not to start a case, but to ask about liability if someone ignored posted warnings and encountered livestock. He documented every trespass, every sign of disturbance, and filed an incident report with the local sheriff's office. No confrontation, no theatrics, just procedure. Still, Karen didn't stop. She began referring to the space behind her house not as Jason's field, but as the community path. And she told one of the neighbors during a block gathering that she'd always felt spiritually drawn to that section of the land. When confronted again, she smiled sweetly and said, "You can't really own the earth, Jason. We're all just passing through it." Jason looked at the woman who had once fed his chickens glitter as a child and realized she believed every word, and that was the most dangerous part. Not that she walked on his land. Not that she disrespected his warnings. Not that she treated his crops like a novelty garden in a wellness retreat. It was that she truly thought she had the right. So he did what he always did, what his father taught him to do. He documented. He planned. He waited. But deep down, Jason knew that waiting only worked until someone kicked open the wrong gate, and Karma, quiet, grazing Karma, would not be patient forever. It wasn't long after the last polite warning that Jason came to understand something crucial. Politeness was a currency that meant little to people like Karen, where he saw it as a foundation for peaceful coexistence. She saw it as an opening, a weakness, or worse, an invitation. The morning it truly began, he woke early, as usual, to inspect the lower east quadrant of the property where he'd recently planted a new grid of feverfew. The sun was barely over the horizon, and the dew still clung thick to the soil, glistening like frost. Jason sipped coffee from an old enamel mug. Its edge chipped and let the steam fog his glasses while he mentally ran through the day's tasks. Check the southern irrigation line, rotate the compost pile, inspect Karma's hooves, make the supply run. Before noon. It was a quiet moment, and it should have stayed that way. But when he reached the clearing, what he saw made him stop cold. 2 sets of footprints led directly through the feverfew rows, not along the narrow path he maintained for harvesting, but directly across the beds. The indentations were deep, pressed into the soft soil, the size and shape of athletic sneakers, one pair smaller than the other. Adult and adolescent, likely. Whoever it was had walked a straight line from the tree line behind Karen's property, through the crops, and vanished into the brush on the opposite side. What made it worse was the bag. A reusable canvas tote, like the kind handed out at organic food co-ops, hung from a broken fence post, forgotten. Inside were lavender stems, unripe echinacea heads, and handfuls of other herbs Jason knew were still weeks from proper harvesting. He didn't touch it. He just stared at the bag as the heat started to rise in his chest, slow and thick, like sap. That same afternoon, Jason walked the perimeter again, noting several more disturbances. The faint but unmistakable signs of someone dragging something heavy over the shallow ridge behind the barn. A small pile of sunflower husks that didn't come. From his seed stock, a tuft of Karma's shed fur snagged on a branch that hung far too low for the bull to have brushed against on his own. It wasn't just trespassing anymore. Someone was walking his land like it was a shortcut to their backyard yoga mat, treating it like a foraging trail, a tourist stop. And if they were getting close enough to Karma to touch him, then it was only a matter of time before someone got hurt. Jason didn't scare easy, but liability wasn't a joke. A bull, even a trained one, was still a bull. He went home, retrieved a printed copy of the property deed, then made a trip into town. He filed a formal notice of trespass with the sheriff's department, not because he expected immediate action, but because he wanted everything documented. Dates, incidents, photos. He dropped off the report, spoke briefly with a deputy who nodded along with mild interest, and returned to the farm that evening feeling slightly more armored, if not at all relieved. That night, he placed another camera, this one mounted discreetly on the exterior of his greenhouse, angled to catch the northeast field and the footpath from the Locke property. He went to bed later than usual, irritated but focused, falling asleep to the familiar weight of Karma's occasional lowing outside the window. What he didn't expect was the note. It appeared the next morning, taped with floral-patterned washi tape to his mailbox. The paper was thick, the kind people used for invitations, and smelled faintly of rosewater. The handwriting was slanted and unnecessarily ornate, clearly composed with great care. It read, "Dear Jason, I feel like things have gotten off to a rocky start between us, and I wanted to clear the air. I walk the land because it speaks to me. Your plants are beautiful, but more than that, the energy out there is healing. I've been going through a lot since my divorce and just need space. Surely you can understand that. I hope we can find a middle ground. The earth isn't meant to be owned. Namaste, Karen." Jason didn't crumple the letter. He folded it, placed it inside a file in his office labeled Locke Incidents, and sat for a moment at his desk, staring out the window. The arrogance in her tone, wrapped in the polite language of healing and understanding, struck him harder than if she'd shouted obscenities. She wasn't apologizing. She was justifying, reframing her violations as emotional necessity, her boundary crossing as a spiritual right. Jason wasn't a man who cared for drama. He didn't gossip, didn't speculate, didn't let his mind wander to the worst-case scenario before there was reason to. But even he had to admit that something about this situation didn't sit right. He'd dealt with property disputes before, neighbors who didn't understand boundary lines, people who left junk too close to his fence line, a hunter or two who wandered too far. But they always backed off once things were made clear. Karen, however, wasn't backing off. She was escalating, slowly, methodically, and with a smile on her face. The next week, it got worse. Jason found tire tracks behind his barn. Not from a truck, too narrow, probably a bicycle or an e-scooter based on the tread. Someone had entered the property through the utility gate, the one behind the compost trench he only opened once a month. That lock, he discovered, had been replaced. Not broken, not cut, swapped. Same model, same color, but the key didn't fit. He stared at it for a long time, then laughed quietly to himself, a dry, incredulous sound that echoed off the tin roof. That night, he called the same deputy, left a message, and followed it up the next morning with an email attaching footage from the greenhouse camera. It showed a blurry figure, female, ponytail, hoodie, stepping over the inner row of fencing, phone in hand, and stopping to kneel by the elderberry plants. The timestamp was 6:14 a.m. Jason's lawyer, Michael Rayner, came out later that week. They walked the property, reviewed the footage, and discussed the idea of a formal cease and desist. "You've got cause," Rayner said, "but the challenge is proving intent and harm. The courts don't like issuing restraining orders for spiritual trespass." Jason didn't laugh. "Then we file civil if she steps foot again," he said. "We build the case until the stack crushes her argument." It was 2 days later that he found the wrapper. Beneath Karma's feed trough, half buried in straw, was the crinkled foil of a protein bar, the trendy kind with chia seeds and beet extract. Jason picked it up carefully, read the brand name, and let out a breath. The same bar had been in the tote bag he'd found weeks earlier in the field. He stepped back, called Karma, and watched the bull approach the fence with his usual calm. No signs of agitation, no injuries. But the fact that someone had gotten close enough to feed him, without Jason noticing, was unacceptable. It was a Tuesday when he made the decision. He typed a final letter, addressed it to Karen Locke, and had it delivered by certified courier. The letter was 3 sentences long. "You are hereby notified that all further entry onto my land will be treated as unlawful trespass. Any attempt to approach my livestock, interfere with my crops, or bypass perimeter barriers will result in immediate legal action. This is your final warning." There was no response, but 2 mornings later, Karma was restless again. And this time, when Jason reviewed the footage from the trail camera, he saw what looked like the outline of 2 figures standing at the edge of the field. Not entering, just standing, watching. He didn't sleep much that night, and when he woke, he unlocked the gate to the south paddock and let Karma roam freely across the west field. He didn't say anything. He didn't make a scene, but the gate creaked open with the sound of something final, something earned, something inevitable. The thing about escalation, Jason had always believed, was that it rarely announced itself. It wasn't dramatic, not in the way television made it seem. It didn't come with shouting or the slamming of doors or grand declarations. Real escalation was quiet. It slid beneath the surface of a situation like a cracked foundation, imperceptible at first, but eventually capable of splitting walls. That's how it felt now. Like the ground was shifting beneath him, not fast, but enough to make him stop mid-step, enough to make him look over his shoulder when he walked the field at dusk. Karma had adjusted quickly to his extended range. The bull was calm, as usual, and spent his time grazing along the ridge where the shadow of the woods met the property line. Jason reinforced the perimeter fencing again, double-checked the warning signs, and rotated the trail cams to cover deeper angles. He made sure every inch of the land bordering Karen's side was covered, but despite all this, the sense of being watched didn't leave him. The footage from the last few nights had shown nothing distinct. Shadows, the occasional movement of brush, a single bird launching from a low branch. But something about the pattern was wrong. The camera triggered too easily, too often, and always around the same hour. 6 a.m. It wasn't wildlife. It was routine. On a cold Thursday morning, just before dawn, Jason received a knock on his door. It was the sheriff's deputy, Harold Kemp, a man with a mustache that never seemed to move when he spoke and a permanent squint that made him look suspicious even when he wasn't. "Morning, Jason," he said as Jason stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, brow already creased. "Got a report I need to follow up on." Jason motioned toward the chair beside the door. "Let me guess," he said. "Karen." Harold nodded. "Said you threatened her. Claimed she was out walking and your bull charged her. Said you watched from your porch and didn't intervene." Jason stared at the deputy for a long second before setting his coffee down. "She was in the field again?" he asked, voice low. "Past the new fence?" "Allegedly," Harold said with a slight grimace. "But look, I'm not here to accuse, just need your version." Jason didn't argue. He led Harold around the property, showed him the footage from the night before and the morning of the alleged incident. Karen hadn't been on camera. No signs of her presence. But Jason suspected she'd entered through the dense tree line, the one stretch the camera didn't fully cover because of the depth of the foliage. Still, there was no evidence. No footage. Just her word against his. Harold scratched the back of his neck and sighed. "You mind if I leave an incident report on file? Won't go anywhere unless she presses." Jason nodded. "Go ahead." After Harold left, Jason didn't go back inside. He walked to the field instead, stood by the fence, and stared into the woods for a long time. The sky had turned a pale steel color, the kind that promised cold but no rain. His breath came out in clouds. On the other side of the fence, Karen's house stood still. No lights in the windows, no movement. Just silence. But later that afternoon, while checking the southern boundary, Jason found something new. Fresh prints. Not adult-sized this time, but smaller. Lighter. Children's shoes. 2 sets, running parallel, crossing through the herb rows and up toward the edge of the greenhouse. His chest tightened. He followed the tracks to the corner of the fence, where someone had placed a short wooden step on their side. It was painted in soft pastel colors and had what looked like a cartoon sun drawn across the top. A makeshift step stool. Jason's jaw clenched. He didn't confront Karen. Not yet. Instead, he contacted his lawyer again and asked Michael to send an updated cease and desist with additional language about endangering minors on private agricultural land. Then he sent a letter to the county zoning board requesting an official property reassessment to verify and restate the fencing boundaries. He wasn't going to be dragged into a shouting match across the field. He wanted paperwork. Irrefutable. Public. But as he submitted the forms, Michael said, "Just a heads up. She might respond with something bigger. People like her don't back down. They double down." The prediction proved true. 3 days later, Jason received a letter, not from Karen, but from a legal firm based in a nearby town. Inside was a notice of intent to file a complaint. Karen was alleging that Jason's fence line encroached upon an unmarked but historically acknowledged right-of-way trail that had once connected the Locke property to the eastern woodlands. The letter stated that, based on oral historical testimony, she intended to pursue recognition of a natural easement through his land. Jason read it twice, then laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of convoluted nonsense he'd expected. He called Michael again. "It's not valid," Michael said. "There's no recorded easement, and oral tradition won't hold up without documentation, but it's meant to exhaust you, legally and mentally." Exhaustion was beginning to creep in. Jason was spending less time tending the field, more time documenting it. He felt like a man trying to keep his boots dry while the water rose inch by inch. Even Karma sensed it. The bull's routines were shifting. He had begun sleeping near the gate, closer to the house, as if he, too, expected something to come through. One morning, Jason found a small bouquet tied to the corner of his fence with twine. Wildflowers, loosely bundled with a paper tag that read, "For peace." No signature. He untied it, examined it, and tossed it into the compost bin. 2 nights later, someone cut the wire to the North Trail camera. Jason didn't discover it until the following morning when he checked the memory card and found only static after 3:17 a.m. He repaired the line, installed a second hidden camera in the same area, and replaced the motion sensor with one triggered by heat. Then he called the sheriff again, filed another report, and sent a notice to the local farm bureau about ongoing interference with agricultural infrastructure. Still, nothing came of it. Karen, for her part, kept her distance. She wasn't seen on camera again, but her presence hovered. Handwritten notes left on the fence, flower petals sprinkled near the property line, a meditation bell someone had hung from a tree that now chimed every time the wind changed direction. Jason removed it all, methodically, and burned the notes in his wood stove without reading them. The final straw that week wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even visual. It was auditory. Jason was tending to Karma late in the evening when he heard it. Laughter. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Female voices, somewhere in the woods beyond the field. Then a metallic clang, like something falling against the fence. He stepped into the clearing, flashlight in hand, but the sound was gone. Only silence remained. Karma was staring into the trees, muscles taut, his breath fogging the air like a steam engine. Jason stood beside him, scanning the darkness. He didn't call out. He didn't chase shadows. He simply whispered, "All right," and turned back toward the house. That night he reinforced the western gate. He didn't close it. He left it unlatched, the way one might leave a trap door, not out of aggression, but as a final acknowledgement that boundaries ignored long enough would eventually open. And when they did, it would be on her. Not him. Jason hadn't expected the escalation to come through official channels, but perhaps, in hindsight, he should have. It came quietly, as these things often did. No confrontation, no visit to the door, just a letter from the county assessor's office, folded neatly and left in his mailbox with his regular post. The letter, wrapped in the sterile language of bureaucracy, informed him that a petition had been filed for a re-examination of historic community pathways and shared-use trails, referencing vague environmental ordinances that hadn't been enforced. In decades. The petitioner, Karen Locke. The implication, however carefully worded, was clear. She was trying to use local legislation to legitimize her intrusions, and if the county board decided to even temporarily recognize her claim, Jason would be the one forced to accommodate. Not because she was right, but because the process itself allowed room for temporary permissions, provisional surveys, and the kind of bureaucratic back and forth that exhausted honest landowners into quiet submission. Jason stared at the page in his kitchen, his thumb leaving a faint smudge of grease across the margin. His silence thickened, not with confusion or fear, but with the focused heat of strategy. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. It was a targeted maneuver framed in polite civic language designed to strip him of the one thing he had always held sacred, control over his land. And she was doing it without stepping foot on his property, at least not in ways that could be proven. Her footprints had become signatures, her fences made of paper, her tactics as insidious as creeping roots undermining foundation stone. He called Michael again, who promised to file a formal objection with the county office, citing the complete absence of precedent or legal standing. But even Michael admitted that the process would take weeks, and in the meantime, the board could grant temporary access for environmental evaluation, which, if not directly enforced, at least opened the gate, figuratively and literally, for Karen to claim legitimacy. "They'll dress it up in neutral language," Michael said, "but make no mistake. It's a power move." Jason didn't argue. Instead, he did what he always did when the world stopped making sense. He went back to work. But something had changed. His movements were sharper, more economical. He walked his rows not just as a caretaker, but like a man preparing a battlefield. He repositioned his trail cameras, not just for visibility, but to create overlapping fields of view. He placed fluorescent markers along the property line, visible even under low light, each one bearing the parcel number and a laminated copy of his deed. He installed a second perimeter of rope, symbolic, not functional, but visible from a distance. A message in case anyone was watching. I know what you're doing, and I'm not moving. 2 mornings later, he discovered that someone had placed stacked stones just beyond the edge of his eastern field. Not on his land, but close. Too close. The cairns weren't random. They were neatly arranged in a circle, each one balanced with a flat slate on top as though part of some amateur ritual. In the center, someone had left a small candle stub, burned halfway down and smudged with lavender wax. Jason crouched, stared at the arrangement for a long moment, then swept it flat with the toe of his boot. He didn't document it. Some things didn't need to be processed through forms and legal notices. Some things just needed to be ended. That evening, he took Karma out of the enclosed pasture and walked him, slowly and deliberately, to the wide western field near the property boundary. The bull, calm and compliant, followed without resistance. When they reached the edge, Jason turned him loose. Karma sniffed the air, let out a low grunt, and began to graze. Jason stayed with him for an hour, standing watch as the dusk settled in. He wasn't doing it to provoke. He was reminding whoever needed to see it that the land was not a park. It was alive, occupied, guarded. The next day, the board's environmental consultant arrived unannounced. Jason was in the barn, repairing a hinge on the rear feed trough when he heard tires crunching on the gravel. He emerged to find a white sedan parked just outside his gate, the logo of the county seal stenciled on the side. A woman stepped out, mid-30s, clipboard in hand, bright green vest with reflective stripes. She was polite, neutral-faced, and she introduced herself as Carla from Environmental Services. I'm not here to enforce anything, she said quickly as though anticipating resistance. Just doing a preliminary assessment for a citizen-filed inquiry. It's purely procedural. Jason nodded once and said nothing. Carla hesitated. Would it be possible to walk the perimeter with you? It'll be less than 30 minutes. Jason shook his head slowly. You're not stepping onto my land until this is resolved officially. You can walk your side of the fence. I'll do the same on mine. To her credit, she agreed. They walked, separate but parallel, and Jason watched her scribble notes each time they passed a trail camera or hand-painted boundary marker. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then his answers were clipped and factual. She didn't seem hostile. In fact, she looked uncomfortable with the whole thing. When they reached the western fence, she paused and glanced at the field where Karma now stood. Is he always out like this? She asked, gesturing toward the bull. Jason met her gaze. He is now. Carla said nothing further. She finished her route, handed him a summary slip, and left without incident. That night, for the first time in a long time, Jason couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of the clarity that had begun to settle in his mind. Karen wasn't going to stop. Not with notes, not with fences, not even with legal barriers. She had decided, somewhere in that self-righteous mind of hers, that his land belonged to her sense of purpose, her emotional healing, her imagined connection to some deeper energy that exempted her from rules. And Jason understood now, more than ever, that there would be no moment of realization on her part, no recognition of boundary. She wasn't lost. She was deliberate. And that made her dangerous. The middle of the night brought a sharp knock against his window. Jason moved instantly, grabbing the flashlight he kept beside the bed, his boots already by the door. But when he stepped outside, There was no one there. Just the darkness, the distant trees, and Karma, standing alert in the field, staring into the woods. Jason scanned the tree line but found nothing. Still, something shifted in the air, an absence, a tension, the quiet knowledge that someone had been too close, too recently. He didn't call the sheriff. He didn't write another report. He just walked back inside, locked the door, and circled a date on the calendar. It was time to end this. Not with threats, not with retaliation, but with presence. Undeniable, immovable, and patient. Just like the land. The next wave didn't come with a bang. It arrived through a ripple, a subtle shift in the daily rhythm of the land that only someone like Jason, who had walked the same soil every day for decades, would even notice. It started with the crows. For the past week, he'd observed an unusual pattern. They clustered along the trees behind the Locke property, not for feeding or nesting, but as though waiting. Then came the dogs, not strays. Suburban mutts, leashless, collar bright, let loose to roam near his fence line, barking at Karma and digging shallow divots near the irrigation ditch. Jason began finding fresh disturbances each morning. Turned over stones, flattened seedlings, a broken section of trellis that had snapped at an angle too high for animals to reach naturally. At first, he thought it coincidence. The weather had been erratic, and even the sturdiest setups had their limits. But then he found the incense. A half-burned stick, wedged between the slats of the east fence, smoldering faintly in the early dawn mist. It was lavender. His lavender. And next to it, nestled in a small depression in the soil, was a flat stone with 3 lines carved into it. Straight, broken. Jason stared at the markings for a long while, his breath slow and even, the cold seeping through his coat. He didn't touch the incense. He didn't touch the stone. He simply walked back inside, found the field journal he kept for crop rotation and pest patterns, and documented every detail: location, time, weather conditions, and, without editorializing, wrote a simple observation: possible symbolic placement. 3 days later, he received an invitation. Not handwritten, not informal, but a printed tri-fold flyer placed neatly in his mailbox, sealed in a clear plastic sleeve. The front bore a watercolor rendering of Karen's house, redrawn with exaggerated elegance. Crystals in the windows, vines cascading over the eaves, birds mid-flight. Inside, the message read, "You are invited to join the first seasonal gathering of the Rooted Awakening Collective, a celebration of land, healing, and ancestral reconnection. Guided meditation, herb walks, energy balancing. All are welcome. All are safe. We begin at sunrise." There was no mention of his name, no acknowledgement of proximity, but the map printed on the back showed the planned walking route, and that route cut directly through the center of Jason's western field. Not near it, not beside it, through it, as though it belonged to them. Jason stared at the invitation over his kitchen table as if expecting it to catch fire on its own. He placed it in his Lock Incidents folder, closed the cabinet, and picked up his phone. This time, he didn't call Michael. He called the sheriff's department directly and requested a deputy on site. Not later. Not after it happened. He wanted someone present at dawn the next day. "Sir," said the dispatcher, "we can't deploy a deputy to sit on private land just because someone might walk through it." "It's not someone," Jason replied. "It's a group. It's coordinated, and I have documentation going back 6 months. The dispatcher paused, then transferred him to Kemp, who agreed to stop by for a drive-by around 6:30 a.m. But Jason was already ahead. That night, he moved Karma to the western edge, letting him graze near the field's midpoint where the planned route would cut. He reinforced the electrified fencing, low voltage, just enough to deter, and set up a new trail camera hidden inside an overturned water barrel. He marked the ground discreetly, placing survey flags in a staggered line where past damage had occurred. Then he sat on his porch and waited. Not for confrontation, but confirmation. Sunrise came slowly, bleeding orange through the trees like a warning. At 6:05 a.m., Jason heard them. Footsteps, murmurs, the shuffling of shoes against soft soil, then the sound of laughter. Soft, hushed, but unmistakably smug. A group of 5, all women, rounded the bend through the trees. Karen led them. She wore a flowing linen shawl, arms raised slightly as she spoke about connecting with ancient growth and stepping beyond the illusion of borders. None of them saw Jason standing 50 yards away, still, silent, and recording everything on the camcorder mounted beneath the porch awning. Karma noticed them first. The bull's head lifted, his stance widened, shoulders square, muscles drawn taut under thick hide. He didn't charge. He didn't bellow. He simply began to walk, deliberate, unhurried but unwavering, toward the sound of their voices. Karen froze mid-sentence as she turned and saw him. One of the women shrieked. Another dropped her thermos. Karen held up a hand as if that gesture held any power and took a step back. Jason didn't move. Karma advanced to within 20 feet, then stopped. His hooves dug lightly into the soil, nostrils flaring. The women stood paralyzed. Karen stammered something about respect and nonverbal cues, but no one was listening. The air had shifted. Even the birds fell silent. That was when the sheriff's car pulled up. Deputy Kemp stepped out, surveyed the scene, and walked briskly to the fence line. "Everyone back off the property line now," he called out. "This is private land." Karen started to speak, but Kemp cut her off. "Ma'am, I've got a report filed, I've got camera footage, and I've got a notice of intent from your group that clearly shows you mapped a route through land that doesn't belong to you. This is your one chance to walk away." To her credit, Karen did. Slowly, with all the grace of someone trying to exit a stage without admitting the performance had failed. The others followed, silent, their linen wraps snagging on brambles. Karma watched them go, then snorted once, turned, and resumed grazing. Later that day, Jason filed a full complaint. Michael drafted a formal letter of trespass, and together they submitted documentation to the county magistrate requesting an emergency hearing for a protective order. It was granted 2 days later. Karen was legally barred from entering, approaching, or organizing any events within 50 feet of his property line. But it didn't end there. She posted online, naturally, cryptic quotes about land theft and the illusion of ownership, never naming Jason directly, but the message was clear to her small, fervent audience. She painted a new mural on the side of her house. A bull, looming over a shattered fence, beneath which were drawn wilted herbs and open palms. Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. 2 weeks passed in tense silence. Then came the note, tucked beneath a rock by his mailbox. No envelope. Just a single torn sheet of notebook paper, the handwriting shaky and uneven. I was wrong. I see it now, but the earth remembers. Jason burned it without reading it twice. The next day, he installed a second gate, closer to the main road, with a lock that wasn't visible from the outside. He upgraded his trail cams to cellular models. Instant upload, time-stamped, secure. He added solar motion lights along the fence line, not to illuminate, but to announce. And he returned to his work, slowly reclaiming the rhythm of field and season. But the air remained tight, as if the land itself still held its breath, and Jason, methodical as ever, knew the second storm hadn't passed. It had just stepped back, waiting. It happened on a Sunday, the kind of overcast morning that smothered the land in a low ceiling of dull gray light and left every surface damp to the touch. Jason was up early, as always, inspecting the root to spread in his chamomile beds and making note of weather shifts that could delay the next harvest rotation. Karma paced slowly near the far end of the field, tail flicking methodically, head down as if sensing the dissonance that hung in the air like a taut wire stretched between trees. There had been no incidents in the past week, no new notes, no appearances, no visitors, and no strange artifacts left at the fence line. It was the kind of silence Jason didn't trust, the kind that had the stink of forced retreat rather than surrender. He kept his daily routine steady, monitored the cameras twice a day, and double-checked every gate before sundown, knowing in his bones that this wasn't over. And that morning confirmed it. When he made his way back toward the barn just after 9, he noticed the latch on the secondary utility gate had been shifted. It wasn't broken, forced, or open, just rotated, as if someone had handled it and then tried to return it to its exact previous position. Only they hadn't. Jason's security setup was meticulous. Each gate had a faint chalk mark at the latch base to signal tampering. This one was smudged, rubbed just enough to be noticed by the trained eye. He didn't touch it. Instead, he circled wide and approached from the other side, heading toward the far western camera mounted beneath the overhang of a water pump shed. When he plugged into the feed archive and queued up the last few hours, he found the proof. Just after 5 a.m., a figure, slender, hooded, barefoot, had approached the gate from Karen's side, ducked beneath the lowest beam, and slipped inside. She moved with certainty, not hesitation. She wasn't scouting. She was enacting something. Jason watched as she stepped carefully into the field, carrying a small woven basket and what appeared to be a ceramic bowl. She knelt near the eastern plot, scooped something from the basket, and scattered it around the roots of several lavender clusters. Then she set the bowl down, placed both hands over it, and stayed like that for nearly 10 minutes, head bowed, motionless, as if in prayer. Finally, she stood, turned back toward the trees, and exited the way she came. Oh, Jason felt no immediate anger. Just a hollow, simmering pressure behind the sternum, the way tension coils itself when it has no place to go. This wasn't carelessness anymore. It wasn't some passive-aggressive push for coexistence. This was willful desecration, symbolic, invasive, and deliberate. It didn't matter what she thought she was doing. Healing, blessing, grounding. The land was not hers. The crops were not hers. The quiet was not hers to shatter with her rituals. And Jason understood, in that moment, that her refusal to be bound by rules would not be cured with warnings, fences, or letters. He spent the next 2 hours calling in the incident. He sent the footage to Deputy Kemp, who promised to log it and follow up with Karen directly. He forwarded everything to Michael, who said they would petition the judge for a permanent restraining order and a potential civil case for damages. But Jason didn't wait for the paperwork. He closed the folder on his desk, walked outside, and opened the main pasture gate. Karma, sensing the shift, lifted his head and trotted forward, snorting once before moving to the newly available grazing path. Jason stood still, watching until the bull had settled into the rhythm of the open land. Then he returned to the house, sat on the porch with a notepad, and waited. At 3:17 p.m., the trespasser returned. This time, she wasn't alone. 3 people came with her, 2 women and a man, none of whom Jason recognized. They wore neutral colors, carried large tote bags, and moved as if rehearsed, navigating toward the very spot Karen had visited that morning. He watched them from the porch, unmoving, his pen pausing mid-word as he tracked their route. No hesitation, no attempt to knock, no gestures toward his house or a wave of acknowledgement. They simply walked his land like it had already been absorbed into the community map Karen had created in her mind. Jason stood slowly and descended the steps. He said nothing at first, just walked toward them, his boots deliberate against the soft soil. When he was within earshot, he spoke in a calm, even tone. "You are trespassing. You need to leave immediately." The man turned, surprised. "We're not hurting anything. We're just visiting the healing point," Karen said. Jason cut him off. "Karen does not speak for this land. And you are all here illegally." One of the women stepped forward. "This is sacred ground. We're not disturbing it. We're honoring it." Jason didn't blink. "You've got 60 seconds. They didn't move. He pulled his phone, showed the live feed of the sheriff's response system already on call, and tapped the screen twice. That got their attention. They retreated quickly, muttering about energy fields and closed mines. Jason didn't follow. He watched them go, then turned to check on Karma. The bull had not strayed far. He was grazing uphill, slow and deliberate, ears flicking. But he was alert now. Jason could see it in the way he turned his massive head as the visitors exited. Karma didn't charge. He didn't roar. He just watched. And that was more than enough. Deputy Kemp arrived 20 minutes later, took Jason's statement, reviewed the footage, and promised to deliver a formal warning to Karen and her guests. But Jason saw it in Kemp's eyes. Fatigue, the weariness of dealing with people who twisted rules until they frayed. That night, Jason prepared. Not for war, not for some final dramatic showdown, but for resolve. He rechecked every gate, every lock, moved Karma closer to the central field, charged every backup battery for the trail cams. Then he sat in the dark of his kitchen and wrote a letter, not to Karen, not to the sheriff, but to the county registrar. It was a request to place a conservation overlay on his field, restricting all external foot traffic for ecological reasons, enforceable under state agricultural protection laws. It would take weeks, maybe longer, but he would make it permanent. And if she returned before then, he had the footage, the warnings, the legal documentation. And a bull named Karma, who didn't speak in platitudes or forgiveness, but whose steps across the land were loud enough to silence any sermon. In the weeks that followed the last confrontation, the air around Jason's property began to shift. Not with dramatic revelation or any sweeping gesture of closure, but with the slow, steady movement of systems beginning to respond to pressure. The footage from the incident was submitted not only to the sheriff's office but also to the Agricultural Protection Board, the Zoning Committee, and the Regional Farm Bureau. Michael filed the final documents for a formal conservation overlay designation, and Jason's property was placed under a 60-day temporary restriction zone, legally barring all non-authorized personnel from crossing its perimeter. It wasn't an injunction in the theatrical sense, but it was permanent enough. And this time, when Karen's name appeared on the violation report for unauthorized access to protected cultivation land, the tone from county officials was different. Less dismissive, less indulgent, it seemed that even bureaucracy, when stacked deep enough, could push back against arrogance masquerading as spiritual necessity. Karen didn't reappear in the person, at least not visibly. Her car stayed parked in the same position behind the house, her blinds drawn tight, her online presence growing louder as her physical presence receded. She posted daily now, cryptic messages about persecution, energy blockages, and the toxic masculine hold on sacred land. But Jason didn't monitor her accounts. Others did that for him, neighbors mostly, some of whom had started to drop by with quiet nods and cups of coffee, leaving messages on his porch like peace offerings. One even brought a tray of lemon bars and said nothing except, "She tried to sell me essential oils. I get it now." It wasn't a victory lap. Jason wasn't interested in public validation. What mattered was that the boundary was now visible, official, and enforced not just by law, but by the land itself. No one crossed it anymore. Karma's routine returned to normal. He paced the eastern edge in the morning, grazed along the midline at noon, and settled near the barn at night. His presence, once considered symbolic, had become simply part of the rhythm again. The field began to heal. The disturbed patches took root. The fence posts held. The soil line regained its structure, and Jason, though still watchful, returned to the work that grounded him: tending, planting, restoring. The county hearing regarding Karen's infractions never turned into a public spectacle. She didn't show up. Her lawyer entered a quiet plea of non-contestation, and the board issued a formal censure along with a binding no-contact order. The fine was minor, but the ruling was binding. Karen was prohibited from entering within 50 feet of Jason's property, organizing any group events adjacent to it, or referencing his land in any promotional material. It was, by all accounts, a bureaucratic end to a personal siege. But Jason didn't celebrate. Instead, on the morning the overlay was officially recorded, he walked the entire perimeter of his land in silence. No clipboard, no camera, no legal documents in hand. Just a slow, deliberate walk, each step placed with the quiet reverence of a man returning to a space that had, for a time, been violated. When he reached the west gate, he stopped and drove a new post into the ground beside it. Onto that post, he screwed in a fresh sign. Not a warning, not a threat, but a statement. Hand-carved into a piece of cedar, it read, "Private land, shared with no one who refuses to ask." Below it, in smaller letters, "Karma still roams." And then he let the field rest. Not because it was over, but because, finally, it was quiet.